How's it going, Chumpy Dubs? My name is Team and welcome back to another video. We're coming back, I know. We're not going to be doing any gameplay today, guys, simply because Shadow of War is a bit of a dead game, and, well, I've just been enjoying myself this summer. Of course, any of you guys that have been stuck around the channel will know, last summer I went sicko mode on videos, but of course, Shadow of War is a bit of a dead game now, and this channel has kind of died due to my own incompetence, and I do apologise for that. But today I'm going to be talking about it's more or less a discussion video, because it was a really cool idea that I came up with, I don't know, maybe a couple of weeks ago, and it's just sort of one of those things that's been grinding in the back of my brain, and I thought, you know what, let's just make a video on it, just to let you guys know that I'm not dying, and yeah, I don't know, I feel like this would be a good idea. This is a good follow-up on my previous video, where I discuss a sequel to Shadow of War, so of course that will be linked at some point in this video, on this video and at the end screen, so make sure you guys watch that if you're interested in anything Shadow of War related. But effectively, guys, we're going to be discussing this idea, and effectively, it's a potential concept to combine two of my favourite games. Well, it's not two of, like, the top favourite, but two of some of my favourite games, alright? Effectively, if you guys have watched the sequel video to Shadow of War, you'll know that Monolith hasn't announced any plans to make, like, a sequel for Shadow of War, despite there being potential for them to potentially, like, continue the story, which is what I mainly discussed in that video. I believe this may need to be a result of the fact that Shadow of War performed quite poorly on release date due to the microtransactions and the fact that the Shadow Wars, the final fourth act, was like incredibly grindy, and so people weren't too happy with it. And yeah, so that was pretty much the case with Shadow of War. We're not going to be getting anything new for a long time. On the other end of the spectrum, though, we have a game called Warhammer 40k Space Marine. I think there's still a video up on this channel where I've played it. It's not too popular now, but it is hands down one of the best Warhammer 40k, and I would argue Warhammer in general, games that have been made of all time. Total War Warhammer is like more of an exception to that, because of course that's more of a strategy based game, but that is still quite successful. But in general, Games Workshop hand out their rights for Warhammer Fantasy. Well, it used to be Warhammer Fantasy, it's now Age of Sigmar, and 40k. They hand those rights out to literally everyone. The amount of like really bad Warhammer games that have been made is pretty bad. But Space Marine is now one which I think sticks out, and it is fantastic. If any of you guys have not played it, you should. I think, effectively it came out in like 2011, and so of course it's on the old gen of consoles, but you can still get it on PC quite cheap, I think, unless they buffed up the price since I last looked. I got it really cheap on a deal. And effectively it's just a really good third-person game, and I think that's almost going to give a hint of what my idea is. Effectively, I want to see Monolith implement their nemesis system into other genres and other universes. Of course, we've had Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War, which is, of course, Lord of the Rings. Of course, they kind of did butcher the lore, but we kind of look over that. I mean, I never really liked Lord of the Rings to begin with, but, you know, Shadow of War, banging game, so. But effectively, I would like them to see implement the nemesis system into a Warhammer 40,000 game. And this sounds mad at first. You're probably thinking, hold up, getting Shadow of War and then bringing it into like a sci-fi element. Then how, like, it may not seem like it's gonna work, but hear me out, guys. I've thought about this a lot, and there's lots of potential avenues that they'll be able to go with this. One side note is that there was a game that attempted to recreate Warhammer 40k Space Marine. That was Eternal Crusade, and that game completely failed, pretty much. I think it's on Steam. It might be free to play actually, but it's pretty dead. No one plays it. And that was effectively trying to replicate Warhammer 40k Space Marine with PlanetSide 2 elements, so much more on like a war-based standpoint with lots and lots of players. However, I want to create something that's more in line with what Space Marine was, and that was up front a single-player campaign game. However, I would like to implement it in such a way that it has sort of like an open world. Imagine the Nemesis system, you know, an integration of the Nemesis system into the Warhammer 40k universe, where you could have a map similar to something that you saw from like the Dawn of War games, from like either Soulstorm or Dark Crusade. In those, you have like 4 or 5 planets in a galaxy, and effectively the whole point is all the races come together on that particular location due to like the warp storms or etc, and effectively they're fighting over the control of all these planets. Quite simply, what you could do is you could just treat each of these planets like its own region, like you have in Shadow of War. That way you could easily create diverse environments, just like in Shadow of War. You can have like a desert-themed world, a jungle-themed world. Literally anything is possible. And because you have Warhammer, it's aside from the fact that you have like the basic tabletop lore, which you can see, oh, you got these races, that stuff, but the lore which is explored outside of the tabletop game is incredibly expansive. There's all sorts of wildlife that they could introduce, and quite frankly, I would love to see an integration of some sort of demon world, because that would just be absolutely nutty. Nutty. Oh my god, my voice is going. Sorry about this. But like, imagine just a demon world where it's like maybe like an end game region. You go in, and it just happens to open up due to something that's happened in the story, and you just set foot on a demon world. And as you walk along, whammo, a bunch of demons spawn in, absolutely mad stuff, and you can have like a bunch of random like modifiers and all sorts going on. Oh, it sounds absolutely chaotic, and that sounds great, to be honest. But yeah, as I've said, 40k is an incredibly expansive universe rich with lore, so they could literally do anything they wanted to from a design standpoint. But I think what we've really got to tie in here is the nemesis system, okay? This is why I think Warhammer 40k will work very well with this. I think the obvious translation would be to use the 40k space orcs. It's orcs, except they spell it with a K, which I actually think looks better than C, but whatever. The point is these can actually be substituted really, really well in the place of the Lord of the Rings orcs that we saw in Shadow of War. Think about it. The tribes and the classes could easily be converted into a 40k universe. For example, the Warhammer 40k orcs, the space orcs, have like a class which is just a commando. Alright, and that's very, very simple. It's obviously just it would be an extension of the assassin class. However, commandos have invisibility. Well, I'm not sure if they still have that in the rules, but the point is it wouldn't be mad to have an orc just, make an invisibility device. Alright, they have that. Okay, it's cool. And so they obviously could just work as an assassin type class. The pain boys, which act as like the orcs medics, they could actually be used as some sort of implementation of a commander type class from Shadow of War, as they could provide like an aura of health regen or like a damage boost. But I think probably my favourite idea would be the implementation of the Weird Boy. Of course, we had mystic orc captains in Shadow of War, and so they were supposed to be like these sorcerers that could do all sorts of mad stuff. But really, all it was occasionally you get like a super, super rare orc that could use necromancy, but then that was expanded into other like classes anyway, so that didn't really matter. But then the only thing that the mystic orcs, like the mystic captain orcs, had to themselves was like the teleport. And even then, it was a bit naff because they could still miss. So, but however, the weird boys in 40k Orc are absolutely insane. Anyone who's read the lore of Orc psychic powers know just how hilarious it would be. You could literally have like an awkward weird boy captain teleport in using the jump. That's literally what the spell is called, the jump. He could teleport in out of nowhere, green lightning going everywhere. He spawns in with a bunch of boys and then just straight up out like ambushes the character, like the main character. And then he'd also like the ability to shoot like laser beams, or he'd be able to like buff up his troops, like all sorts. The orc psychic powers just sound funny, and I think they would actually give a lot more potential for Monolith to branch out and actually create a more spell based like caster sort of character in the Nemesis system. Because as I said, we had the Mystic class, but come on. They were a bit naff as far as the sorcerer would go. You kind of forget that they're actually supposed to be like wizard sort of types until unless you look into it, I suppose. But a weird boy just going in, the potential they could have for different sort of like traits and abilities they could have on these types of classes would be insane. For example, if you had like the pain boys, you could potentially have like an epic trait, which would work very, very similar to like the buffs that affect gangs. Because in the lore, pain boys can give cybernetic enhancements to their boys, like their like gang. So imagine that, you have like a pain boy who's walking around, he's obviously got like his weird syringes and like his iron jaw, all sorts of like mechanical limbs. And then he has his bodyguards, which are all equally like customized, like they've got some randomly generated like metal arms, and that potentially gives them like extra health and all sorts of stuff. Like that sounds pretty gnarly as well. But then, of course, you've got numerous other like potentials, like the custom force field, for example. It's a device which is designed by the mechs in Warhammer 40k Orcs, or in the Orc lore, which could actually act in a very, very similar way to how tank captains in Shadow of War could come back. They have their second wind. You could make it so the main character goes in for like their killing blow, but then bam, the custom force field comes up, stops it, and then it like explodes or something, and that would be like an indication, oh yes, now I can go in for the killing blow. the translations are honestly quite insane. I would love to go on at length talking about all the ideas I have for these translations, but I don't want this video to go on for like 70 years. So yeah, let's move on a little bit. Although I would be content with the idea of having, just having, classic Space Marines and Orc warbands, imagine if all the other races could be implemented. Chaos Marine sorcerers that could like summon out demons. You could have like the Eldar with their like warp spiders, which can literally like teleport very, very short distances, go zip, zip, zip into the battlefield, kill things, and jump out of combat really quick. You could have the Tyranid Lictors, for example, which are like pretty much like a chameleons on steroids, and they could turn up and they could be really, really good for like infiltration. If we're thinking it more of like the fortress standpoint, if you were playing as like a Tyranid character, I suppose you could send in lictors, and they would have their own little game mechanics, because of course a lictor wouldn't be able to just pretend to be on the enemy's side. They would have to like hide in their own lairs, and they'd be able to like do a specific, I don't know, there's certainly things that they could twist it. So they have very, very differing, like very slightly differing mechanics when it comes to infiltration and all sorts. I would expect that the game, if it was to be made very, very restricted, I suppose, they would just allow the player to play as a Space Marine of some sort. But if they really wanted to make the player progression more akin to Shadow of War, very, very narrow, so it's obviously just a set main character, they could easily make some sort of wacky backstory. Maybe they have some sort of like Space Marine scout that gets caught in the warp, and then like maybe he starts getting gifts and like mutations from the Chaos Gods, which would allow him to get sort of abilities you might see akin to Shadow of War. And then you could create like a bit of a story element around that. You could talk about how the scout is then struggling against the Chaos Gods' corruptions. Like, that's in itself is incredibly reminiscent of the story of Talion, because of course the game's been out for long enough, I don't really care about spoilers. He puts on Isildur's ring, and then after that he has that teetering aspect, doesn't he? He has to like try and fight against Sauron's current control of him, but then at the same time he still needs to have that power so he can defend Gondor. But of course that's if they wanted to create a very, very linear character arc. If they were to be incredibly open-ended with it and just give the player complete character customization, we were talking in that video about how you could potentially play as an orc with your own customization. Well, imagine this. Imagine if you could choose any one of the races. They have their own slight different bonuses, and that would give you the potential to play through a sort of open-ended campaign with each of the races, giving a good 7 or 8 playthroughs. And because you have all the different races, the amount of potential enemies that you can find in this nemesis system, you could start a rivalry with some sort of Tyranid hive tyrant, and then the Scar system could easily be implemented onto that. You could, but then you could also have maybe a rivalry with some sort of like an orc war boss or like an orc mech. You could easily cut off like the limb, for example. If we go with Tyranids, for example, we cut off the limb of a captain. Or in this case, I suppose a hive tyrant, and then it comes back. Well, this time, because of how Tyranids work in the lore, you could have a sort of a new tendril arm or something has grown in that place because Tyranids can regenerate. Like, there's all sorts of stuff that they could do, and like I'm not sure how they'd be able to replicate the shame system. Perhaps you could literally make it that you can give like warp, like perils of the warp, and just give a game mechanic to allow you to inflict that on a captain. Or or an enemy. I mean, I'm gonna have to say stop saying captains, because of course, if other races are introduced, they're not all gonna be called captains. But you could inflict perils of the warp, and that would act in a similar way to the shame system. And then perhaps if how you can have an orc captain in Shadow of War become like a maniac. What if you inflict perils on the warp on an enemy like an orc, like an orc mech boy? Next time he turns up, he's grown an extra arm, because guess what? He's been mutated by chaos. Absolutely mad stuff. Maybe he's just grown like an arm that now has its own control. Like the personalities they could create. Maybe they could create a type of character which has a chaotic arm as a result, like a growth, but then it operates in its own mind. So maybe like in the middle of combat, he just like has to start like fighting against his own arm or something. Like It's mad. They could literally, the only thing they're restricted by is their own imagination, but that may be the potential problem. As I said, almost anything in Shadow of War can be replicated into the 40k universe, but then every single game mechanic can be improved upon. You got Fortress Assaults, where you can add extra levels of depth, especially since different races will have different mechanics in terms of how they could infiltrate. Maybe you can have more, I don't know, maybe more of like a political system, where maybe you'll be able to make something more akin to like Total War, maybe you'll be able to make like alliances or something with different races and then turn around and stab them at the back, therefore giving a much more, replay value for the campaign, because maybe you choose to go in doing more of a pacifist run. Maybe you're like, oh, I'm going to make friends with everyone I can and then only kill the ones I need to. But then you come in again, and this time you go, you know what, nah, we're killing everyone, and that's more of like a harder playthrough, Maybe that's a sense of difficulty. If you want to play a hardcore playthrough, you make enemies with everyone, and then, let's just watch the world burn. Like, they could totally do stuff like that. As I said before, there's a lot of wildlife in, like 40k lore, but if they wanted to keep things pretty, like, simple, stuff like Graugs, for example, in Shadow of War, could just be replaced with giant Chaos Spawn. The Chaos Spawn are generally, like, a go-to. Oh, yes, we need something to just stand here and kill things. Chaos Spawn. Like, that's pretty much how they do things in most Warhammer games. Like, you could just, but then because they operate in their own sort of mindset, it wouldn't be, unusual for a Chaos Spawn to just turn around and just start bashing up its, like, Chaos Space Marine ruler or something, And of course, that gives even more potential for, like, character depth and, like, development. You could have, like, maybe you have a Chaos Sorcerer that is, like, particularly affectionate with this one Chaos Spawn, and then when you kill the Chaos Spawn, he goes absolutely mad, and then that's like, and then he tries to turn himself into a Chaos Spawn. Like, oh my god. That sounds actually hilarious, though. You just, like, you send some sort of psyker absolutely mad after an engagement, and you pretty much do the equivalent of a shame, and he just turns himself into a Chaos Spawn. That does sound pretty funny. That could be pretty much like a substitute, I suppose, for the Necromancy, how you can have all captains that come back to life later. Just, yes, turn him into a Chaos Spawn, yes. And I think one of the key reasons why I think this idea could happen is the fact that, as I said, Games Workshop hand out these rights left, right, and centre. So the idea that Monolith getting their hands on Games Workshop, like, rights for, to make the game, I reckon that's very, very reasonable. I mean, like, come on, it's Monolith, they'll certainly be able to make a deal with that sort of thing. Anyone who liked playing Shadow of War or Shadow of Mordor will want to come and try this game, because, of course, it's another implementation of the Nemesis system. Anyone likes anything Warhammer will also want to try this, simply because there's not a lot of games out there for Warhammer fans to enjoy. So I reckon there is actually a lot of potential for it to be profitable, provided it isn't, like, ruined with microtransactions. However, I think there are certainly some drawbacks to this problem. To this concept. Hardware isn't something that usually is considered, but Shadow of War by itself is like 60 gigabytes, and had to have a pretty semi-decent, like, computer to play. Imagine if we had this game where it was on the same, maybe if it was the same scale as Shadow of War, maybe slightly bigger, but then every single race was introduced, with their own depth and stuff. Like, the sheer size of the game file would be titanic by itself. But then the system would, like, of course, we're going into the next generation. The PlayStation 5 is going to be coming out, I'm not sure when it is, but sometime. And by the time that the next Monolith game comes out, it will probably be on that next gen. Like, it's gonna need a lot of system, like a big system in order to run all this complicated stuff if they want to expand the Nemesis system in meaningful ways. But I mean, I guess if they wanted to make it more like akin to more of like a reskin, I suppose, of Shadow of War, they could, as they go from my previous idea with just creating a main character and maybe just making it so it's just against space orcs this time, instead of introducing the other races. Maybe that's something they want to do. So it's obviously a lot more restricted. But I mean, come on, I would still be happy if I could play again in the 40k universe, provided the gameplay is good. But that is probably the biggest problem to this. 40k, Space Marine, and Shadow of War, despite both being third-person hack-and-slash themed games, do actually play quite differently. 40k has a lot more shooting elements into the game. In the lore, I suppose. It may be hard to implement, since a lot of weapons in 40k are, like, fully automatic. There would be of course there would be no shortage of like melee-based combat, which is probably where most of the gameplay will want to take place. But I mean, if you put some sort of restriction on ammo and stuff, maybe it would stop it from becoming more of a cover shooter. But then again, maybe a cover shooter is maybe where that's the nemesis system needs to go now. Maybe that needs to revolutionize it. Maybe. I mean, sure. We're not sure where that could go. But I mean, if you were to take the 40k universe, armies such as the Tau wouldn't be able to be featured in a game like Shadow of War, akin to that with close combat, because they pretty much have no melee capabilities. They have that one character who has like a sword, but like the rest of the army would get thrashed. Like, unless they made some sort of rubbish, like, going against the law and making the Tau. Oh yes, they now do close combat. Like, people aren't going to be too happy about that. Let's just put it that way. But then, of course, you can still have really, really long-range combat, because, of course, there were snipers in Shadow of War. There's easily enough snipers in 40k that they could totally bring in. But then, I think if they start bringing in a lot of shooting elements into a game that was previously very, very melee-based, they may end up coming up with some sort of confusion in what the actual game is. Of course, the game Shadow of War is designed to be a melee game, with the occasional bow shot. If you're building upon that formula and trying to add a lot of shooting elements, that may not work very well. So, but of course, I don't know. Maybe they could do whatever they want. But that's why they may end up wanting to go. I sadly admit this, but maybe Age of Sigmar is a better fit for this type of game. Yes, range combat does exist in Warhammer Fantasy as well, but it's mainly toned down to archers and crossbowmen, which is far more in line with the style of Shadow of War. I mean, I would still play it, but I'm far less interested in Age of Sigmar, and when you've got two fantasy universes, the games would be very, very similar. However, if you were to take the Nemesis system, bring it into a sci-fi setting, and one as insane and just incredible as the 40k universe, I think that is going to be the key point. That is what's going to make this best game of, this is what's going to be, make it game of the year sort of thing, It needs to be a big step up, a big revolutionized, system. You can't just go, oh yes, it's Shadow of War, but now things look slightly different. You can't really do that. Otherwise, it's just going to be pointless. Though, of course, I will still play it because it's dank. But yeah, guys, I've pretty much rambled on for far too long now. But yeah, what do you guys think about this kind of concept? Bringing the Nemesis system into a sci-fi setting, and in particular, the Warhammer 40k universe. Of course, I'd love you guys to leave your ideas down below in the comments. And of course, I have lots and lots more ideas of certain implementations of game mechanics and lore. So I could make a much longer video discussing each aspect of this game's potential design if you guys would like that. But I mean, I'm not too sure on that. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. So, as you guys know, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Please, I need it. And I hope you all guys have a wonderful day.